The bruises on Ilara's arms told a story she had stopped trying to hide. She knelt on the cold stone floor of the great hall, her forehead pressed to the ground alongside the other servants sent as tribute from the eastern provinces. Her threadbare dress did little to shield her from the chill, and even less to cover the purple and yellow marks that bloomed across her skin like a map of her suffering. Lord Varen had been generous with his punishments this past month. A dropped tray, a look held too long, breathing too loudly near his study. Each infraction earned its own mark, its own lesson. By the time he'd announced she would be part of the servant tribute to the Lycan king, Ilara had almost felt relief. Almost. Because everyone knew what happened to human servants in the Lycan king's castle. They were worked until they collapsed. Used and discarded. The wolves saw humans as little more than prey with useful hands. At least, that's what Lord Varen had told her with that cruel smile of his as he'd shoved her into the wagon. "Perfect for you," he'd said. "The beast will probably eat you within the week. Consider it mercy. I was growing tired of your face anyway." Now she knelt in the great hall of Blackmore Castle, surrounded by servants who trembled as violently as she did. The stone beneath her knees was smooth, worn down by centuries of supplicants. The air smelled of pine and smoke and something else, something wild and ancient that made her heart race. Footsteps echoed through the hall, heavy, deliberate. Each one sent a vibration through the floor that Ilara felt in her bones. The other servants pressed themselves lower. Someone whimpered. Ilara kept her eyes fixed on the stone, counting the cracks, the tiny imperfections. She would not look up, would not draw attention, would not. The footsteps stopped directly in front of her. She could see boots, massive black leather boots that could crush her skull with a single step, the hem of dark trousers. The presence before her radiated heat like a furnace, and she found herself leaning toward it despite her terror, her cold, starved body desperate for warmth. Silence stretched. The hall held its breath. Then a voice, deep as mountain thunder, rough as hewn stone, spoke a single word. "Rise." The command wasn't loud, but it resonated through her chest, through her very bones. Ilara's body obeyed before her mind could catch up, and she found herself standing on shaking legs, eyes still downcast, staring at those impossible boots. "Look at me." She couldn't. She couldn't possibly. "Little one." The voice gentled, just slightly. "I won't ask again." Ilara raised her eyes. The Lycan king was a giant. That was her first thought. He stood nearly 7 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to block out the firelight behind him. His hair was black as midnight, swept back from a face that seemed carved from granite. Sharp jaw, high cheekbones, a nose that had been broken at least once. He looked like he was in his mid-30s, but his eyes were ancient, golden, like molten honey, with vertical pupils that marked him as something other than human. Those eyes held centuries of memory, of power, of things Ilara couldn't begin to comprehend. And right now, those eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that stole her breath. Something shifted in his expression. His nostrils flared, his pupils dilated. A low sound rumbled from his chest, not quite a growl, not quite a word. Then his gaze dropped to her arms, to the bruises visible beneath her thin sleeves, and his entire demeanor changed. The air in the hall turned thick, heavy. The other servants pressed themselves to the floor with renewed fervor, and even the guards along the walls seemed to shrink back. The Lycan king's golden eyes had gone dark, his jaw tight, his massive hands curling into fists at his sides. When he spoke again, his voice was barely controlled. "Who hurt you?" Ilara blinked. Of all the things she'd expected, demands, commands, violence, a question wasn't among them, and certainly not spoken in that tone, as if her answer mattered, as if he cared. "I—" Her voice cracked from disuse. Lord Varen hadn't liked when she spoke. "My lord!" "These bruises—" He reached out, and she flinched violently, squeezing her eyes shut against the blow that was surely coming. It didn't come. Instead, she felt warmth hovering near her arm. Not touching, just present. Waiting. "I'm not going to hurt you." His voice had changed again, softer now, though still rough. "I'm asking who did this to you. Who marked you this way?" Ilara opened her eyes. The Lycan king, this creature of legend and nightmare, was crouched slightly to meet her gaze, his massive frame folded to bring himself closer to her level. His hand still hovered near her arm, patient, undemanding. She didn't understand. "Lord Varen," she whispered. "My former master, he said I was clumsy, disobedient. He said I deserved—" A growl cut her off. Not from the king, but from somewhere in the hall. His guards, she realized, were reacting to her words. But a single raised hand from their king silenced them instantly. Lord Varen. The name dropped from his lips like a death sentence. "Of the eastern provinces." "Yes, my lord." "He sent you here as tribute." "Yes, my lord. He said—" She swallowed hard. "He said you would probably eat me within the week." Something dangerous flickered in those golden eyes. But when the king spoke, his voice remained controlled. "And what do you think, little one? Do you think I'm going to eat you?" Ilara looked at this giant creature before her, this being of impossible power who had every right to do exactly as her former master predicted. She looked at his hands, large enough to wrap entirely around her waist, currently held carefully at his sides. She looked at his eyes, ancient and predatory and waiting, patient. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "I don't know what to think anymore." Something softened in his expression. The tension in his shoulders eased, just slightly. "That's fair." He straightened to his full height, and Ilara had to crane her neck to maintain eye contact. "What's your name?" "Ilara, my lord." "Ilara." He said it slowly, as if tasting the syllables. That rumbling sound came from his chest again. "You're not going to be eaten, Ilara. You're not going to be hurt, not here, not ever again." She stared at him, uncomprehending. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The stories, the warnings, the terror in Lord Varen's voice when he spoke of the Lycan king, none of it matched the creature standing before her now. "I don't understand," she breathed. The Lycan king, this impossible, terrifying, confusing being, smiled. It was small, just a slight curve of his lips, but it transformed his harsh features into something almost gentle. "You will?" he said. "In time." He turned to one of his guards. "Take her to the eastern chambers, the ones with the fireplace. Send for the healer, fresh clothes, and food. Real food, not servants' rations." His golden eyes found hers again. "You'll stay in my household, Ilara. Not as tribute, not as punishment. You'll be cared for here." "But why?" He studied her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his ancient eyes. "Because you deserve kindness," he said simply. "And because something tells me Lord Varen is going to regret the day he laid a hand on you." He turned and walked away before she could respond, his massive form disappearing through a side door, leaving Ilara standing in the center of the great hall with her heart pounding and her mind reeling. She didn't know what had just happened. She didn't know why a monster had looked at her bruises and offered her protection instead of pain. But as a kind-faced guard gently gestured for her to follow him toward warmth and food and safety, Ilara felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. And that terrified her more than any wolf ever could. The eastern chambers were larger than the entire servants' quarters where Ilara had spent the last 5 years of her life. She stood in the doorway, afraid to step inside, afraid to dirty the polished wooden floors with her worn shoes. A massive bed dominated one wall, piled high with furs and quilts in deep blues and silvers. A fireplace crackled on the opposite side, already lit, already warming the room to a temperature Ilara had forgotten existed. There were chairs, a writing desk, a wardrobe tall enough to hold a dozen of her threadbare dresses. "These can't be for me," she whispered. The guard, a Lycan woman named Mira, with kind eyes and silver streaks in her dark hair, gently guided her inside. "The king's orders. You're to stay here for as long as you like." "But I'm a servant. I should be in the servants' quarters with the others." "You're not a servant here." Mira's voice was firm, but not unkind. The king was very clear. "You're a guest." Ilara wanted to argue, wanted to explain that there had been some mistake, that she wasn't anyone special, that she was just a clumsy girl who couldn't even carry a tray without dropping it. But before she could find the words, there was a knock at the door. A healer entered, an older Lycan man with gentle hands and spectacles perched on his nose. He examined her bruises without comment, his expression carefully neutral, though Ilara caught the way his jaw tightened when he saw the full extent of them. The marks on her arms were nothing compared to the ones hidden beneath her dress, her ribs, her back. The places Lord Varen knew wouldn't show. The healer applied salves that smelled of herbs and something faintly magical. The pain began to fade almost immediately. "These will heal within a few days," he said quietly. "The king has asked me to check on you each morning until they're gone." "The king asked you to—" Ilara stopped herself. None of this made sense. Kings didn't concern themselves with the bruises of servant girls. They didn't give them guest chambers and healers and fireplaces. After the healer left, servants arrived with food. Real food, just as the king had promised. Roasted meat and fresh bread and vegetables that weren't wilted or rotting. A pot of tea that smelled like honey and chamomile. Ilara ate until her stomach ached, then ate a little more, half convinced the food would be taken away if she didn't finish it quickly enough. She slept in the massive bed that night, buried under furs so soft she almost cried. She kept waiting for someone to burst through the door and tell her it was all a mistake, that she needed to get up, get to work, stop pretending she was anything more than she was. No one came. The next morning, Mira arrived with new clothes, simple but well made, a soft grey dress that actually fit her, with long sleeves to cover her fading bruises. Ilara touched the fabric like it might disappear. "The king would like to see you," Mira said. "If you're willing." Willing. As if she had a choice. As if a servant could refuse a king's summons. But something in Mira's tone made her pause. "And if I'm not willing?" Mira smiled. "Then I tell him you're resting, and he waits until you are." Ilara didn't know what to do with that information, so she simply nodded and followed Mira through the winding corridors of Blackmore Castle. She found the Lycan king in a private study, not the throne room she'd expected. He sat behind a massive desk covered in papers and maps, and when she entered, he rose immediately. The movement was almost too fast for her eyes to track, a reminder that despite his gentleness, he was something other than human. Ilara. Her name in his voice did something strange to her chest. Please, sit. She sat in the chair across from his desk, perching on the edge like a bird ready to take flight. He noticed. Of course he noticed. Those golden eyes seemed to see everything. Did you sleep well? Yes, my lord. The healer said your injuries are healing. That's good. He paused, studying her face. You don't have to call me my lord, you know. My name is Kale. Kale? She turned the name over in her mind. It didn't suit him. It was too short, too simple for someone so vast and ancient. I couldn't possibly— You could. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. I want to explain something to you, Ilara, about why I reacted the way I did yesterday, about why you're here in these chambers, being treated as a guest rather than a servant. Her heart began to pound. Here it was, the catch, the price she would have to pay for the soft bed and the warm food and the healing salves. Among my kind, Kale continued, there is something called a mate bond, a connection between two souls that transcends choice or circumstance. When a Lycan meets their true mate, they know, instantly, irrevocably. His golden eyes held hers. The moment you raised your eyes to mine in that hall, I knew. Ilara stopped breathing. You're my mate, Ilara, my true mate, the one I've been waiting 300 years to find. The words hung in the air between them. Ilara's mind raced, trying to process, trying to understand. She was a servant, a nothing, a clumsy girl covered in bruises who had been sent here as an insult, as punishment, as dash. That's why Lord Varen's treatment of you enraged me so deeply, Kale said, his voice roughening. Not just because hurting anyone that way is monstrous, but because he hurt you, my mate, the other half of my soul. His hands curled into fists on the desk. I wanted to tear him apart with my bare hands. I still do. I don't— Ilara's voice came out as a whisper. I don't understand. You don't know me. We've spoken twice. How can you possibly— I know it doesn't make sense to you. Not yet. Kale's expression softened. And I want to be clear about something. This bond, this connection, it doesn't obligate you to anything. I'm not going to force you to accept me. I'm not going to demand anything from you that you don't want to give. She stared at him, waiting for the qualifier. The but, the accept. It didn't come. I've waited 3 centuries, he said quietly. I can wait longer. I can wait forever if that's what you need. All I ask is that you stay here. Let yourself heal. Let yourself be cared for. And if someday you decide you might want to know me, truly know me, then we can talk about what this bond means. But only if you choose it, only if you want it. Ilara felt tears prick at her eyes. She blinked them back furiously. She hadn't cried in years. Lord Varen had beaten that out of her early. Why? The question escaped before she could stop it. Why would you wait? Why would you give me a choice at all? You're a king. You could just— I could. His voice was gentle but firm. But I won't. You've spent your whole life having choices taken from you, Ilara. Having your voice silenced, your worth denied, your body hurt by people who should have protected you. He held her gaze. I refuse to be another person who takes from you. When you come to me, if you come to me, it will be because you want to. not because you have to. A single tear escaped, sliding down her cheek before she could stop it. Kyle noticed. Of course he did. But he didn't comment on it, didn't reach for her, didn't try to comfort her. He simply waited, patient as stone, giving her space to feel whatever she needed to feel. I don't know how to do this, she finally said. I don't know how to be whatever you're asking me to be. I'm not asking you to be anything. He smiled, that small, gentle curve of his lips that transformed his harsh features. Just be Alara. That's more than enough. She didn't believe him. Couldn't believe him. A lifetime of being told she was worthless, useless, a burden. It didn't disappear because one person said otherwise, even if that person was a king. But as she sat across from this impossible creature who looked at her like she was something precious, something worth waiting centuries for, she felt that terrifying hope flutter in her chest again. Maybe she could learn to believe him. Maybe, given enough time, she could learn to believe in herself. Over the following weeks, Ilara learned what it meant to be cared for. It started with small things, meals that appeared at regular intervals, whether she asked for them or not. Clothes that fit, in colours she was actually allowed to choose. A fire that was always lit when she returned to her chambers, the room warm and waiting like an embrace. But it was Kale himself who surprised her most. He didn't push, didn't demand her time or her attention or her affection. He simply made himself available. If she wanted to see him, he was there. If she needed space, he gave it without question, without resentment, without making her feel guilty for needing it. They fell into a routine. Breakfast together in his study, if she felt up to it. Walks through the castle gardens in the afternoon, where he told her stories of Blackmore's history. The battles fought, the alliances forged, the kings who had come before him. He never touched her without permission, never crowded her space, never made her feel trapped. And slowly, so slowly she almost didn't notice it happening, Ilara began to relax. "You're smiling," Kyle observed one afternoon as they walked through the garden. The autumn leaves crunched beneath their feet, and the air smelled of wood smoke and approaching winter. Ilara touched her lips, surprised to find he was right. "I suppose I am." "It suits you." His golden eyes were warm as he looked at her. "You should do it more often." She ducked her head, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. She wasn't used to compliments, wasn't used to being seen as anything other than a nuisance, a burden, a thing to be tolerated at best and punished at worst. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Anything." "What was it like? Waiting 300 years, I mean." She glanced up at him. "Did you ever think you wouldn't find her? Your mate?" Kyle was quiet for a long moment. They walked in silence, the crunch of leaves the only sound between them. "There were times I wondered," he finally admitted. "Times I thought perhaps the bond had made a mistake, that I was meant to be alone." A shadow crossed his features. "I watched others find their mates. My generals, my advisors, my friends. I attended their bonding ceremonies, celebrated their happiness, and then returned to an empty bed in an empty castle." Ilara's chest ached at the loneliness in his voice. "I stopped hoping after a while," he continued. "It was easier that way, to accept that some Lycans simply never find their other half, to focus on my kingdom, my people, my duties." He looked down at her, and something raw flickered in those ancient eyes. "And then you walked into my hall. Bruised, trembling. expecting me to hurt you like everyone else had. And I knew. Knew what? That every year of waiting had been worth it. His voice roughened. That I would have waited 1,000 more if it meant finding you. Ilara stopped walking. Her heart was pounding, her breath coming short. No one had ever spoken to her like this. No one had ever looked at her the way Cale was looking at her now, like she was the answer to a question he'd been asking his entire life. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I know." "Not of you." She needed him to understand this. "I'm not scared of you anymore. I'm scared of wanting this, of believing it's real, of letting myself hope and then having it all taken away." Cale turned to face her fully. He didn't reach for her, but she could feel the effort it took him to hold himself back. His hands trembled slightly at his sides. "Ilara." Her name was a prayer on his lips. "I will spend every day of my existence proving to you that this is real, that I'm real, that you deserve every good thing this world has to offer, and more." "How can you say that? You don't know." Her voice broke. "You don't know the things I've done, the things I've let happen to me. I'm not the person you think I am." "Then tell me." He took a careful step closer, still not touching, still giving her space. "Tell me who you think you are." The words spilled out before she could stop them. Years of pain, of shame, of secrets she'd never told anyone. How she'd been sold to Lord Varen's household at 12 years old to pay her father's debts. How she'd learned quickly that silence was safer than speech, that invisibility was the only protection she had. How the first time Varen had hit her, she'd been so shocked she hadn't even cried. And how by the 100th time she'd stopped feeling anything at all. She told him about the other servants who'd learned to look through her rather than at her, because association with the master's favourite target brought nothing but trouble. About the nights she'd spent curled on the cold floor of her quarters, too bruised to climb into her thin cot. About the way she'd started to believe that maybe Varen was right. Maybe she was worthless. Maybe she deserved every blow. By the time she finished, tears were streaming down her face. She couldn't look at Kyle, couldn't bear to see the disgust she was sure would be there now that he knew the truth of her. But when he finally spoke, his voice was shattered with rage. Not at her. Never at her. "I'm going to kill him!" Ilara's head snapped up. Kyle's eyes had shifted, the gold bleeding into something darker, more primal. His body was rigid with barely contained violence, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely human. "I'm going to find Lord Varen, and I'm going to tear him apart piece by piece. I'm going to make him suffer for every bruise he put on your body, every tear he forced from your eyes, every moment of fear he made you feel." "Cale, you were a child." The words ripped from his throat like a wound. "You were a child, and he." He stopped, chest heaving, fighting for control. When he looked at her again, his eyes were wet. "You are not worthless, Ilara. You are not broken. You are the bravest, strongest person I have ever met. To survive what you survived, to still be capable of kindness, of hope, of trust." His voice cracked. "You are extraordinary, and I will spend the rest of my life making sure you know it." Ilara stared at him. This powerful, ancient creature who was trembling with fury on her behalf, who had tears in his eyes because of her pain, who looked at her like she was precious beyond measure. And something inside her finally broke open. She stepped forward and pressed her hand against his chest. His heart thundered beneath her palm, wild and desperate. He went completely still, barely breathing, waiting for her to decide what she wanted. "I don't know how to do this," she said again. But this time, the words meant something different. But I want to try. With you. If you'll still have me. Kyle's hand came up to cover hers, gentle as a whisper. His golden eyes blazed with something fierce and tender all at once. I will always have you, he said, for as long as you'll let me, for as long as you want me. I'm yours, Ilara. I've been yours since the moment I saw you. She rose up on her toes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was soft, tentative, a question rather than an answer. But when Kyle's arms came around her, carefully, so carefully, giving her every chance to pull away, Ilara felt something click into place inside her chest, like coming home to a place she'd never been. Like finally, after years of wandering in the dark, finding the light. The letter arrived 3 weeks later. Ilara was in Kale's study, curled up in the chair by the fire with a book she was only half reading. She'd taken to spending her afternoons here while he worked, content simply to be in his presence. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they sat in comfortable silence. Sometimes he would look up from his papers and catch her watching him, and his whole face would soften in a way that still made her breath catch. She was happy, genuinely, terrifyingly happy, and every day she waited for it to be taken away. When the messenger burst through the doors, Ilara's first thought was that her waiting was over. My king. The messenger was breathless, his face pale. An envoy from the eastern provinces. Lord Varon himself has come to Blackmore. The book slipped from Ilara's fingers. The room tilted. Kyle was on his feet instantly, his expression turning to stone. He's here? Now? At the gates, my lord. He's demanding an audience. He says... The messenger's eyes flickered to Ilara and away. He says he's come to collect his property. The word hit Ilara like a physical blow. Property. After everything, after all these weeks of being treated like a person, Varon still saw her as a thing, a possession, something that belonged to him. Ilara. Kale's voice was gentle but urgent. He crossed to her, crouching before her chair so they were eye to eye. Look at me. She couldn't. Her hands were shaking. Her chest was too tight to breathe. Varon was here. He'd found her. He'd come to take her back, and there was nothing she could do, nothing she could... Ilara. Kale's hands cupped her face, warm and steady. Look at me. Please. She met his golden eyes. They were blazing with barely contained fury, but his touch remained impossibly gentle. He cannot take you, Kale said. Do you understand? He has no claim on you, no right to you. You are not his property. You never were. He'll say I am. Her voice came out as a whisper. He has papers, contracts. My father sold me to him legally, in the eyes of the law. The law of Blackmore supersedes the law of the eastern provinces, and in my kingdom, there is no legal ownership of people. Kale's jaw tightened. He has no power here. None. But if you send him away, he'll come back. He'll find another way. Then I'll deal with him. The edge in Kyle's voice made it clear exactly what that meant. Say the word, Ilara. Say the word, and I will end this. Permanently. She stared at him. This king, this ancient and powerful being, who was asking her permission to destroy her tormentor, not demanding, not deciding for her, asking. She swallowed hard. I want to see him. Kyle went very still. What? I want to face him. The words surprised her as much as they seemed to surprise him. But as she spoke them, she realized they were true. I've spent my whole life being afraid of him, running from him, hiding from him, trying to make myself small enough that he wouldn't notice me. I don't want to do that anymore. Ilara, you don't have to. I know. She took his hands in hers. I know I don't have to. That's why I want to. Because it's my choice. Because I'm choosing to face him. Not because I have to, but because I refuse to let him have that power over me anymore. Something fierce and proud flickered in Kyle's eyes. He lifted her hands to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. Then we face him together. They received Lord Varen in the throne room. Ilara stood at Kyle's side, not behind him, not hidden away, at his side like an equal. She was wearing one of the fine dresses that had been made for her, deep blue velvet with silver embroidery, fit for a queen. Her hair was pinned up, her chin held high, and though her heart was racing, her hands were steady. She barely recognized the woman she'd become. Lord Varen strode into the hall like he owned it. He was smaller than she remembered, shorter, narrower, less imposing. How had she ever found him so terrifying? He was just a man, a cruel, petty man who had beaten a child to make himself feel powerful. His eyes found her immediately, and his lip curled. So, this is where my servant girl has been hiding? He turned to Kale with a dismissive sneer. I appreciate you housing her, Your Majesty, but I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. This woman is my property, contracted to my household until her debt is paid, which, he smiled coldly, will take approximately another 40 years. Kyle said nothing. He simply looked at Varen with the patience of a predator who knew exactly when he would strike. The silence stretched. Varen's smile faltered. I have documentation, he continued, pulling a scroll from his coat. Legal and binding. The girl's father sold her to me to pay his debts. She belongs to me. That contract, Kyle said quietly, is not recognized in Blackmore. Be that as it may. Furthermore, Kale's voice hardened. Ilara is not a servant, not property, and not yours. She is my mate, my true mate, my queen. The words rang through the hall like a bell. Ilara's breath caught. Queen. He'd never called her that before. They'd talked about the mate bond, about their future, but he'd never... Varen's face went white. Your queen. My queen. Kyle rose from his throne, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The woman you beat, the child you terrorized, the person you treated as less than human for years. He descended the steps slowly, each footfall echoing like thunder. Do you know what the punishment is, in Blackmore, for harming the mate of a Lycan king? Varen stumbled backward. Now, see here. Death. Kale's eyes had shifted, gold bleeding to black. Slow, painful death. You can't... The treaties, the eastern provinces will what? Kale's smile was terrifying. Go to war over a man who sold a child into slavery and beat her for 10 years? I don't think so. Varen turned to run. He made it 3 steps before Kale's guards seized him. Wait. The word came from Ilara's lips before she could think. Everyone froze. Varen, the guards, even Kale. She descended from the dais, her steps steady despite the pounding of her heart. She walked until she was standing directly in front of the man who had haunted her nightmares for a decade. He looked small, pathetic, terrified. Good. You told me once, she said quietly, that I was worthless, that no one would ever want me, that I should be grateful you kept me at all because no one else ever would. Varen opened his mouth to speak. She cut him off. You were wrong. She held his gaze, unflinching. About everything. I am not worthless. I am not unwanted. I am loved and cherished and valued, and I will be queen of a kingdom that is greater than anything you could ever dream of. She leaned closer. And you will spend the rest of your miserable life knowing that the girl you thought was nothing became everything. She turned her back on him and walked back to Cale's side. Take him to the dungeons, Cale said. He'll await trial for his crimes against the crown. As the guards dragged Varen away, his screams echoing off the stone walls, Ilara felt something release in her chest. A weight she'd been carrying for so long, she'd forgotten it was there. Cale's hand found hers. My queen? He murmured. She looked up at him, this fierce, powerful, impossibly gentle king who had given her back her voice, her worth, her life. My king, she answered. And for the first time in her life, she felt truly free. The bonding ceremony took place on the winter solstice, under a sky blazing with stars. Ilara stood at the entrance to the great hall, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. The gown she wore was nothing like the threadbare dress she'd arrived in all those months ago. It was white as fresh snow, embroidered with silver thread that caught the candlelight and scattered it like diamonds. A crown of winter roses sat atop her head, woven through hair that had grown long and healthy in the months since she'd come to Blackmore. She barely recognized the woman she saw reflected in the mirror that morning. Mira stood beside her, eyes glistening with tears she refused to let fall. Are you ready? Ready. Such a small word, for such an enormous moment. Yes, Ilara said, and meant it. The doors swung open, and she stepped into the hall. Hundreds of Lycans filled the space. Kyle's court, his generals, representatives from every territory in his kingdom. They rose as she entered, a wave of movement that should have terrified her. Once, it would have. Once, she would have shrunk under so many eyes, made herself small, tried to disappear. But she wasn't that girl anymore. She walked down the aisle with her head held high, her steps sure and steady. And at the end of the hall, standing before the ancient altar where generations of Lycan kings had bonded with their mates, Cale waited for her. He was dressed in black, as always, but tonight there was silver threaded through his coat, matching the embroidery on her gown. His dark hair was swept back from his face, and his golden eyes, those ancient, impossible eyes, were fixed on her with an expression that stole her breath. Wonder, reverence, love. She reached the altar and placed her hands in his. They were trembling, both of them, she realized. This powerful king, 3 centuries old, trembling as he held her hands. You're beautiful, he murmured, low enough that only she could hear. You're shaking, she whispered back. I've waited 300 years for this moment. His voice was rough. I'm allowed to shake. The high priestess began the ceremony, speaking words in the old language that Ilara didn't fully understand. But she understood the weight of them, the permanence. This wasn't just a marriage. It was a soul bond, eternal and unbreakable. After tonight, they would be bound in a way that transcended death itself. When the priestess asked if she came willingly, if she chose this bond freely and without coercion, Ilara's voice rang clear through the hall. I do. When she asked the same of Coyle, his response was a growl of affirmation that made the candles flicker. The priestess smiled and stepped back. Then seal your bond, she said, and may the moon bless your union for all eternity. Kale cupped Ilara's face in his hands, tilting her head up to meet his gaze. "I love you," he said. "I will love you until the stars burn out and the world turns to dust. I will love you beyond death, beyond time, beyond everything." Ilara's eyes filled with tears. "I love you too. I didn't think I was capable of it anymore. I thought that part of me was broken beyond repair. But you—" her voice cracked. "You made me believe again. In love. In hope. In myself." He kissed her, and the hall erupted in howls of celebration. The feast that followed was the grandest Blackmore had seen in decades. There was food and wine and music that spilled out into the snowy courtyard. Ilara danced until her feet ached, laughed until her cheeks hurt, smiled until she thought her face might crack from the unfamiliarity of it. And through it all, Kale never left her side. His hand on her waist, his eyes on her face, his love a tangible thing that wrapped around her like armor. Late in the evening, when the celebrations had softened into quiet conversations and sleepy smiles, a messenger arrived with news. Lord Varen was dead. He had been tried for his crimes against the crown, specifically for the decade of abuse he had inflicted upon the woman who was now queen. The evidence had been overwhelming. The sentence had been unanimous. He had been executed at dawn, 3 days prior. Ilara waited for something. Grief, maybe, or guilt, or some complicated tangle of emotions about the man who had shaped so much of her life, even if that shaping had been cruel. But all she felt was relief. "It's over," she said quietly. Kale pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. "It's over. He can never hurt you again." She leaned into him, letting his warmth surround her. "I keep waiting to wake up, to find out this was all a dream, and I'm back in that cold room, and none of this was real." "It's real." His arms tightened around her. "I'm real. This life we're building together. It's real. And I will remind you of that every single day until you believe it in your bones." 1 year later, Ilara stood on the balcony of the Queen's chambers, watching the sun rise over Blackmore. So much had changed. She had changed. The frightened, bruised servant girl who had arrived expecting death had become a queen, beloved by her people, respected by the court, adored by her king. She had found her voice, her strength, her worth, not because Kyle had given them to her, but because he had created a space where she could find them herself. The door opened behind her, and familiar footsteps crossed the room. "You're up early." Kale's arms wrapped around her from behind, and she leaned back into his chest. "Couldn't sleep." The little one was restless. His hand moved to rest on the swell of her belly, and she felt him smile against her hair. "Our little one has his mother's spirit? Or her father's stubbornness?" He laughed, a sound she had learned to treasure, rare and precious as it was. Probably both. They stood together in the golden morning light, watching their kingdom wake. Ilara thought about the journey that had brought her here, the pain, the fear, the long years of believing she was worthless. She thought about the moment she had raised her eyes to meet a king's golden gaze, and everything had changed. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" "For seeing me when I couldn't see myself, for believing I was worth something when I had forgotten how to believe it." She turned in his arms, looking up at the face she loved more than anything in the world. "For asking who hurt me, when everyone else just looked away." Kale's golden eyes glistened. He pressed his forehead to hers, breathing her in. "You were always worth seeing," he said. "You were always worth fighting for." I'm just grateful I get to spend eternity proving it to you." She kissed him as the sun broke over the mountains, bathing them both in light. Once, she had been a bruised servant girl with no hope and no future. Now she was a queen, a mate, a mother-to-be. She was loved, she was cherished, she was home. And she would never let anyone make her feel worthless again. If you enjoyed Ilara and Kale's story, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new tale. Leave a comment below telling me your favorite part, and I'll see you in the next one.